those of you who've been around a long time will know him because he got his PhD here. He finished that in 2021. And then he was here for another year or so, doing a postdoc in my lab. He's gone on to do a number of different things. He now has started his own consulting company, and he's based in Colombia, which is part of where he's from. He's like half Colombian, half American, I would say. There to say.
Yeah.
His specialty is in conservation finance. And that's an area that is really an important area, and I would say gaining in prominence because you can't really protect something unless you can pay to make sure that the rules are enforced, that you can set up the facility, pay for the people. So it's really important and it's relatively new. And Johnny's really at the cutting edge of the field. I don't want to say too much. I want to give him time to talk. I will also say though that he's been nominated for an adjunct assistant professorship here at SoMAS. And his talk today is part of our review and evaluation process for that. Faculty will be voting on that at some point in the near future. So anyway, I hope that you would all enjoy and learn a lot from his talk. Johnny Board.
Thank you, Ellen, for the introduction. Thank you, Laura, for helping facilitate everything. I'm not sure if the mic is working. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So yes, Ellen says this is part Friday seminar, but also part of the procedures of the adjunct nomination process. So this is really part career talk, and I'll also dive into some research subjects to bring everyone up to speed on what exactly is this field of biodiversity or conservation finance, and how does it link to SoMAS's work now and in the future. So a little bit about me. I wear many hats. I have a number of roles and affiliations. So on one hand, since finishing my postdoc in Ellen's lab, I've also been a research associate at the university. So I've continued to publish as part of the university, and also have been engaged with research projects here. I'm also an independent researcher and consultant working with not only universities like Stony Brook, but with a number of foundations, NGOs, government organizations, including the UN. As far as subject matter, my expertise is spread across these areas I'll introduce, called conservation finance and economics, specific conservation interventions or activities such as marine protected areas, and a number of other subject areas, including fisheries sustainability and coral reef conservation. A bit about myself. As Ellen mentioned, I'm born and raised in New York, but I currently live in Colombia, where about half of my family comes from the Caribbean coast in the north, from a coastal city called Santa Marta. But I currently live in Bogota with my wife and our dog at 9,000 feet in the Andes, far from the ocean. But I actually did a lot of my field work for my PhD at SoMAS with various marine protected areas under the country's national park system. I am from New York, though. So much of that critical point in my career, including my PhD and my postdoc. It was 10 years ago that I actually started as a student here, which I can imagine for some of the faculty in here, I can hear some internal groans about how fast time passes. And when I think back to some of the initial roots of my inspiration and pathway here, I was actually on Sesame Street talking about fish when I was 5. There's screenshots from that here. If anyone can guess where that photo was taken, I'll give you the link to the whole thing. And so you think, okay, I finished Sesame Street 20 years later, walking the door at SoMAS, happy into the story, but it wasn't exactly what you would call a linear pathway to get here. I've had a kind of an unconventional career path. Another important place for me, my family, and also my education and my research career has been Maine. I'm a graduate of Bowdoin College in Brunswick. And Bowdoin is a liberal arts school. I had what they call a coordinate major, which was inherently, the foundations of my career really began in interdisciplinary studies. So I was an economics and environmental studies major with an early notion of graphic sciences minor. And it was here that I really started to understand the importance of economic questions related to environmental progress. So I found my passion here really for solving environmental problems by thinking about how we can reframe the relationship between the economy, industry, and the environment. And that continues to be a major presence in some of my research today. But after graduating, I ended up working in the private sector and private sector finance for an investment fund in real estate and renewable energy. So this was quite a divergence from kind of, you could say, my initial career goals. But I decided to transition back towards more ocean focused studies and work in placing the environment again, really at the center by joining the PhD program here at SoMAS, where I was co-advised by Ellen, as well as an environmental economist who used to be on the faculty here named Anthony Bohorquez. By working with Ellen and through the MAR 507 course, I got introduced to the idea of marine protected areas. And this is kind of where the rest of my career in these subjects kind of blossomed from, with this specific tool to protect ocean biodiversity and maintain ocean health for the ocean and for coastal communities as one of the most effective tools for maintaining healthy ecosystems, helping healthy ecosystems recover, and also building resilience against climate change.
John, can you please share your screen? Those of us on Zoom can't see anything. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. There. How about now?
Mary, can you see it now?
So, considering the role that marine protected areas or MPAs can play for promoting ocean health, there's been a number of global targets some of you are probably familiar with, such as historically to protect 10% of the ocean by the year 2020, which is now been scaled to 30% by 2030, also known as 30 by 30. It's that a lot to talk. This is a little bit dated, but right now, just after the UN Ocean Conference in Nice in June, we have finally gotten to 10%, 5 years late, and we sort of round up from 9.6% to 10%. Now the question is, how do you scale from 10% to 30% in just a few years? And as I mentioned, marine protected areas, as Ellen touched on in her introduction, can be very effective, but only when they actually have the tools and resources to do the management or conservation activities that they're set out to do. And so in light of the progress still to be made on ocean protection goals, of the 10% that we have right now, only about 65% of those or more do not have sufficient financial resources to achieve their conservation objectives, and that's one of the greatest barriers towards what we call MPA effectiveness for performance. So this immediately became a major focus of mine, and it translates this issue of insufficient financing translates not only from marine protected areas but other areas of biodiversity conservation, right? So if you look beyond just marine protected areas and thinking about land and sea, there's a biodiversity crisis right now, and there's also a financial crisis with, let's say we have about 150 billion or so invested in biodiversity conservation each year. The estimates for that need to increase that up to nearly $1 trillion. For the ocean specifically, the estimates are about 175 billion per year needed at best, and at the high end, you might see up to 25 billion a year. On average, though, it's been much lower than that. So there's this kind of financial crisis that's also in tune with biodiversity crisis. And we ultimately need to kind of foster some sort of a paradigm shift in the way that financial systems work with ocean health and biodiversity. But it's not just about raising funds, it's also about how our financial systems currently working against it, right? If we need to raise 500 billion to $1 trillion per year for biodiversity, that's great. But if we have 500 billion a year invested in activities through harmful subsidies that are harming biodiversity, then that's part of the equation too. This idea of conservation finance is more than just about raising funds. Some good news is that this 22 to 36 billion in fishery subsidies, depending on who you ask, we can now take off this list because just a few days ago, the World Trade Organization finally ratified a treaty to eliminate harmful fishery subsidies globally. That was in negotiations for 20 years. So that's a big deal finally, which is great to see. But to take this concept still now and thinking about financial systems as well as raising funds, what is this field of conservation finance? And we can describe it in short terms as mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources and align incentives to achieve nature conservation outcomes. I haven't memorized that definition yet by heart, but I should, because I also helped write this definition. One of the coolest things about working in this field is that, as Ellen mentioned, it's become very much more mainstream now. It was very niche when I just started as a grad student. And so even in just my short 10-year research career, I've been able to actually be part of the development of kind of the fundamental theory of this entire field, which is really cool. So again, thinking beyond just raising funds, right, generating, but it's also how we manage and deploy funding. If we magically got $1 trillion check right now, the systems aren't in there to actually deliver those funds to the ground. So that's part of the equation, and also aligning incentives. So when we think of financial solutions, we think of certainly increasing funding for conservation, but can we also make conservation activities more affordable by decreasing the costs? And can you use tools like subsidies or like beneficial subsidies or taxes to incentivize positive actions that are in support of biodiversity while discouraging harmful actions? So some of the work that I've developed over the year, since 2019, I've also been affiliated with the Conservation Finance Alliance. And so we've researched and broken down kind of the entire, we call it taxonomy of conservation finance mechanisms. So giving some sort of structure to the diversity of potential solutions or approaches out there. And so this is a handy tool that we've developed that provides that will break down an explanation of the diversity of mechanisms out there. We've used it as a teaching tool, both for academic settings as well as for professional practitioner settings. And some important things to note is that mechanisms also tend to work in combinations. So there is no one silver bullet, and there shouldn't be, because in order to have resilient systems, you don't want to necessarily rely on one source of funding. I think that resonates with a lot of people right now. But to break it down, and again, this is really just I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but to show the diversity of approaches out there. We've identified what we call 7 classes of finance mechanisms, which might include return-based investments such as loans, bonds, equity investments, micro lending, economic instruments like taxes or subsidies, grants and other transfers, businesses and markets, public financial management, risk mitigation tools, which is really becoming important to something called blended finance, and financial efficiency. And we've broken those into about 35 different categories. And within each of those 35 different categories, there are several different types of solutions. So again, not going to go into any detail here, but to show the diversity and how wide this field really is. Now let's walk through one example in the case that's, that is linked closely to ocean finance, or to ocean finance and ocean science. Let's take the importance of coastal ecosystems like coral reefs for protecting coastlines, particularly during hurricanes as storm surge events, by protecting the coastline through what's known as wave attenuation. So when the storm surges, when there's a storm surge during a hurricane, it helps break down the waves before they get to shore and it mitigates storm damage. There is a great, what we call ecosystem service value to that. And in some cases, ecosystem services like that have been packaged into creative financial solutions to promote the conservation of those ecosystems that are providing that service for coastal communities. So in the case of coral reefs, and this was first pioneered in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, there is an insurance program that was basically developed where hotel owners voluntarily contribute to an insurance fund that in the event of a storm triggers the payout that finances the restoration of the reef after the storm. And also provides some funding for long-term conservation. And I mention this because it's a good example of how this links back to ocean science and the work that institutions like SoMAS is doing. And this example has started to scale in several different countries. And this model has been now used not only for coral reefs, but is now also being piloted for mangroves. So let's break that down. We develop a scientific understanding of what the benefits that different ecosystems and forms of biodiversity can provide. And through the basic science, the fundamental science, we can understand how these interact with coastal communities and develop kind of a socioeconomic rationale, and maybe develop that into a model for how the importance of protecting and managing, in some cases restoring, different forms of marine biodiversity. That then translates, we develop it enough, into a potential financial solution like what you saw for the coral reef insurance funds in Mexico. And then you need to evaluate the conservation outcomes of that as well, monitor that, and that feeds back into our scientific understanding of this as well. So this is just kind of a very basic conceptual flowchart of how I see my field of conservation finance linking to research like that being done at institutions like SoMAS, and why, for me, as part of my career, it's always been really important to stay close to science, because that's when you start to see the next solutions to promote ocean health arise out of. So with that, I'll introduce my three research branches. There's finance for MPAs, which was the focus of my PhD and has continued to be a major focus of mine. As I mentioned before, I also think about how do ocean economic systems affect ocean health? How can they be realigned? How can we rethink or transform ocean economies and related industries to support ocean health? And I'll walk through some examples of international financial platforms that help develop to do that. And then I also have a third branch that I call my exploratory research, which is where I dip my toes into different scientific fields and more academically focused projects. Again, part of my personal research philosophy of always staying close to the science. So going to marine protected area finance, if anyone's ever visited a marine national park or anything like that, you notice there is staff, there are equipment needs. These things all require some degree of financial resources and also community support. And within this question of MPA finance, we have a lack of financial resources. We also know that among a number of MPA practitioners, their training is not in traditional finance and financial management. So there's a need to strengthen the expertise and capacity among MPA practitioners to learn to apply alternative mechanisms, learn to basically fund management and accounting. There's also a lack of practical guidance on helping to increase that capacity. And keeping in mind the need for capacity strengthening here, one of the things that I then decided to focus on, this was the subject of my PhD dissertation, which, come to think of it now, I did my defense remotely because it was the pandemic, so I'm kind of making up for lost time here. Is basically a structured assessment method that could evaluate the current status of the financial sustainability of an MPA and ways to improve it. And I mentioned the status because that's important. That a lot of MPAs have relied on domestic government budgets or philanthropic grants, which can be helpful but aren't always reliable and certainly have not been sufficient globally. So we have to think about alternative mechanisms here, such as a coral reef insurance model. So this walks through basic steps. What is the challenge regarding financing? As far as the background for the MPA, is it that they have enough financing, but they are relying on risky sources, or is it insufficient? Analyzing the funds available, how much additional funding is needed, are current resources allocated efficiently? Looking at current income streams. Are they reliable? Can they be expanded upon? Fourth, assess alternative mechanisms, so how else can more funds be raised, and then looking at all that collectively, what are the best pathways to strengthening financial sustainability to support the management? So using this model, I applied it to 6 different MPAs, Latin America and Caribbean, one in Belize, Bonaire National Marine Park in the Netherlands, Caribbean, and 4 MPAs in Colombia, and the idea was that these would represent different socioeconomic, environmental, and political contexts. So we had everything from open ocean, large MPAs, hundreds of miles offshore, with very limited ability for any sort of infrastructure or surveillance, to areas like the Colombian Caribbean that have 2 million visitors a year, and are flush with cash from the entry fees for tourists. So by doing a combination of desktop literature review, and then also going to these sites and interviewing stakeholders, including practitioners, local fishers or fishing cooperatives, tourism businesses, local government offices, or government offices in the capital city. Ran that information through the assessment methodology that I had developed and could create these kind of recommendations for each area. And you'll see here, it's just very surface level as far as their ability to kind of achieve financial sustainability through either rethinking how current resources are used, addressing weaknesses in the mechanisms that are currently supporting that NPA, or the potential for alternative mechanisms. And we saw everything from NPAs that had a lot of cash flow, but they maybe weren't allocated in an efficient manner, to areas, for each area, we looked at least some potential pathways. Some had more options than others, and usually those options tended to correlate with the kind of diversity of economic systems and activities around the area. And the result of this was, those final results were presented in a final paper post biological conservation, but was the culmination of a series of 4 different publications on this subject. I came out of SoMAS also having this NPA financial mechanisms evaluation tool and an accompanying guide that I had developed. And alongside this comprehensive framework for analysis and financial strategy design. The American Fisheries Society didn't think it was totally worthless, so I want to run her up for their annual Stephen Berkeley Fellowship in 2021. It was a great honor because this is something that was completely outside of their wheelhouse, but they saw value in it. So what now? This final publication on that area of research was in 2023. And I've kind of taken my direction kind of in the direction of what's needed in order to actually achieve global conservation goals. So we know that we need to scale, not just the NPAs in the world to reach 30%. We also need to scale some of the creative financial solutions that help us get there. Alongside continuing to increase finance capacity among practitioners. So as far as my work in NPA finance, since finishing my postdoc, there's kind of 3 other directions there. On one hand, this methodology that I developed as a grad student here, I have since had the opportunity to apply elsewhere nationally in the Seychelles with the Nature Conservancy and Seychelles Climate Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust last year. Ongoing right now for an NPA, regional NPA finance facility with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund funded by the Blue Nature Alliance. And currently in evaluation, the potential to also apply it in Asia next year. I've also helped develop other tools that operate at different scales from local level conservation to the global level. So that's included developing a practitioner's guide and a series of principles with the Blue Nature Alliance and Minderoo Foundation for what we call systems-led financial strategies for supporting marine 30 by 30 at the national level. And that is being kind of folded into a pilot program to actually apply that methodology to 5 different countries starting next year. I've co-developed another marine coastal finance mechanism prioritization tool that considers MPAs, but also outside the borders of the MPA, thinking about the broader system and the economic systems around that. And that we are currently piloting with one grant from the Great Barrier Reef Foundation in a few different countries, and also with another project I'm leading with the Nature Conservancy So 4 different countries in the Caribbean. Another really important area here is in the idea of capacity building and expanding the knowledge of MPA practitioners. It's thinking about where else is thinking about what we call peer-to-peer learning, where there are some MPA practitioners out there that are really well versed in this and have had great success. Can we share their lessons with other MPA practitioners? And this was part of an effort that Christine Santora and I co-led at Impact 5, which is a Marine Protected Area conference in Vancouver, where we brought practitioners from different organizations and MPAs around Latin America and Caribbean to share some of the examples that they have used, particularly in the context of post-COVID, when tourism was not reliable, and they started investigating areas outside of tourism that could help diversify income streams, such as water quality testing services or equipment leasing, and also better coordination and sharing of resources with MPAs around them, and also across borders, national borders. And that we also recently just finally published last month in marine policy. So part of the rationale here was to not only have that interpersonal communication of these ideas in the conferences setting, but to also communicate that further virtually as we could through a publication. One of the things I'm really proud of about this work is that a number of the co-authors here were those MPA practitioners who we brought to this conference who had never published in peer-reviewed literature before. And so this was an opportunity to bring new types of authors to the academic literature sphere that are maybe that are perhaps underrepresented, and also help ground a lot of the academic literature in the real world examples that they can help provide here. So with that, I'll move to the second branch of my research, which is thinking that, okay, we have to raise funds for MPAs, but we also need to think about that relationship between economies and the ocean or broad. So this is what I call transforming ocean economies to support ocean health. So if we look at the different marine industries around the world, we see that roughly ocean-related industries, ranging from shipping to fishing, pharmaceuticals, tourism, energy, even submarine cables, it tend to generate about 6 trillion in revenue per year, which is somewhere in the region of about 10% of global GDP. I think it's a little bit less than global GDP, but I think the 6 trillion figure is underestimated. And the ocean economy is expected to double by 2030. So at the same time, investments in sustainable ocean investments make up less than 1% of the value of the entire ocean economy. So we have this kind of paradox where ocean economies are quickly growing, but we're not seeing the investment needed to maintain ocean health. And for some industries, including pharmaceuticals, fisheries, even shipping with coastal ports related to climate change and sea level rise, there's a point where that growth is not going to be sustainable unless we redirect things or rethink things, particularly to increase investment, right? And there's a lot of interest in investing in ocean sustainability, but there have been a number of barriers. The interest far outweighs the supply of actual ocean health investment opportunities. And there's a number of systemic barriers here that are preventing barriers to entry to helping mainstream ocean finance. This includes the fact that many benefits of conservation are difficult to monetize, right? What is the value of a blue whale? Like these things, a lot of the value of the ocean does not translate to traditional financial markets and economic systems. Very little remains known about the ocean and ocean economic systems. How can you invest in something that we don't really know about, particularly with increasing uncertainty for certain ocean resources with climate change? That's one area with the science and improving the science and investing in the science can actively potentially unlock additional investment for ocean health. A lot of the potential investment opportunities that are out there are very niche or nascent or just not mature enough for the risk tolerance that traditional institutional finance has. So this basically there's a limited track record to say with many ocean sectors models. And again, the investment size and risk return profile is not aligned with investor criteria. How will a multinational bank invest in small scale fisheries in a region like Africa, Latin America, or Southeast Asia. So there's a need to kind of scale opportunities well in order to mature them to a point where we can unlock the institutional private sector finance. And I say private sector finance because we could basically, you look at the amount of private capital traded around the world each year. If you directed 1% of that to biodiversity, that would cover the $1 trillion per year needed. So there's a massive amount of untapped potential there if it can be done and steered correctly, so it's actually supporting ocean health and not inadvertently harming it. So
Can I
one
ask
of
a question about, you have that ocean credit card?
Yeah.
Is that an idea or does it exist somewhere?
There actually is, this is just an illustration, but I was actually in a call earlier this week where apparently in Costa Rica, they have a conservation credit card. Where basically it's kind of like buying a license plate or something like that. You have a credit card or debit card with a frog on it, and a small percentage of your transactions will be donated for conservation purposes.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So that's something that's part of my work in the Caribbean right now. Recently, there's just an interest in trying to scale that. So let's say, for example, this is a platform that I helped develop. This is called the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. And the Global Fund for Coral Reefs is based around the idea that there are coral reefs that can be resilient to climate change, but it's not going to help if they are also being overfished or dynamited or having to deal with high rates of sedimentation or coastal pollution. So how can we invest in areas that will mitigate those pressures through protection, transformation of livelihoods and activities, restoration of the reefs, and also investing in areas to kind of speed recovery for the reefs and also for coastal communities in the events of geopolitical events, natural disasters, what have you. And this is the first, what they call UN blended finance fund, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, dedicated to the ocean. So the idea is to invest in coral reef health by investing in fishery sustainability, sustainable ecotourism, coastal infrastructure, waste management, plastic pollution, and other threats to coral reefs globally. And with a total target investment size of about 625 million by 2030. So here's an example of where my contributions to this blended both my financial expertise and also my scientific expertise from SoMAS. Is that I helped write the investment plan for this, which included a lot of literature review and stakeholder consultations with scientists, so desktop research, to map where they should invest, which is a function of where are the most resilient reefs based on the literature right now, which countries, and which countries also have the right economic and political environments for this type of investment. And then what are developed kind of conceptual model for how that could be done and what the priority sectors for investment should be based on the threats in each given to coral reefs in each given country. And the result of that was this, what we call a blended finance model, where this is kind of a creative way to think about traditional sources of financial support for the ocean, government resources, philanthropic resources. How can we utilize those in new ways? And one of the barriers that I mentioned before was that a lot of investments, because we don't know a lot about the ocean or they're in emerging markets, a lot of ocean investments are perceived as very high risk. And what you have is something called a blended finance model that you can have investment funds that's looking to do more traditional investments, but they need something to help improve the risk return profile. And this is something where grants strategically deployed can help do that by providing technical assistance to scale funds or providing risk loss insurance for potentially risky investments and things like that. So a small amount of funding from governments or philanthropy can unlock much greater quantities in private sector finance. And so these are some examples of some of the investments the Global Fund for Coral Reefs has done today using that model. It includes direct investments, including a $50 million investment for organic fertilizers for sugarcane in Brazil, or ways to upcycle sargassum in the Caribbean for alternative products, including agricultural fertilizer, and also more what we call patient capital or technical assistance, which is perhaps grants for what you might think of as an incubator, or we call a technical assistance facility, to help provide support to take small, innovative ideas and grow them to a scale where they can actually receive institutional investment. And there's a lot of lessons that have been learned from this. And one of the things we've learned from, and I continue to consult with Global Fund for Coral Reefs, but is that in order to have a major impact on ocean health, you need an ocean finance facility that raises more funds independent of government aid, because the Global Fund for Coral Reefs still relied on what we call official development assistance, which is declining globally. Is more flexible to invest in a wider array of sectors and countries than what the Global Fund for Coral Reefs was designed for. So more encompassing beyond just coral reefs, because coral reefs are connected with other systems. If you want to invest in coral reefs, you kind of have to invest in the ocean collectively, right? And it's formed by a coalition of international government institutions, countries, and in partnership with industries, business people, local communities, and environmental organizations. Not only that, we need to scale. We need to raise $175 billion for the ocean each year. The $625 million for the Global Fund for Coral Reefs over 10 years isn't going to do that. So that's where Global Fund for Coral Reefs has helped to inspire what has been announced and is now being designed, a new ocean finance platform that I've also helped support the development of, called the One Ocean Finance Facility. And the One Ocean Finance Facility is designed to not only scale a lot greater quantities of funds, but to also make sure that that funding is additional to any government support for the ocean right now. And relies on reframing ocean economies and industries as not adversaries to ocean health, but kind of willing partners in this. And through that, create a combination of revenue streams. Like, for example, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, recently announced a greenhouse gas emissions tax for shipping, global tax, that type of model, to basically feed into a system that can help or facilitate the issuance of blue bonds that could help catalyze additional what we call commercial capital leveraging. But the idea is that with some input through solidarity fees, levies, or other forms of support from ocean industries acting as partners, can help unlock on a scale of hundreds of billions of dollars. This is really the first initiative I've heard of that is actually talking about scales of funds for the ocean at the level really needed to pay the debt in ocean finance gaps. Yeah, and it's basically part of that idea of rethinking things and really what we call a true paradigm shift, and the idea of repositioning ocean industries as active partners in ocean health rather than exploitators, what we call the blue transition. And the incentives there for them to partner with this is that part of that $170 billion that could be mobilized, $170 billion or more potentially, would also invest in, for example, port facilities that are adapted for sea level rise or stronger hurricanes, things like that. So there is, for these industries that are helping to support this, they're receiving more back than they're putting in, while also allocating some of that funding for conservation. So this is kind of an idea. My role in this has been a lot of research and writing for the conceptualization phase, identifying ocean finance needs, relevant industry stakeholders, and working on kind of the financial structuring for how this could function. And we finally had this announced in Nice during the UN Ocean Conference in June, where it got endorsed by several countries, including by Macron directly. And we're hoping to transition now into the design phase in order to help bring this concept to reality. So that's an example of a couple of different kind of ocean finance platforms that are looking to operationalize some of the key questions that I've identified through my research and that are all being increasingly called for by the global environmental community. And now I have this third branch of research that I call exploratory research. What do I mean by that? I mentioned before here when I went through this conceptual flow chart, it's always really important for me to stay close to the science. So I'm always keen to engage in research in different areas that are maybe outside of my core expertise, but also help widen my perspective and expertise to other fields that have the potential to be relevant to, or could be the foundation of a number of areas that could be creative solutions, for example, for ocean finance or things, remembering that it's really our scientific understanding of ocean systems that flows up eventually into those potential models to support ocean health. So what does that look like for my research career so far? This has included an ecosystem service valuation study on shellfish aquaculture in the Long Island Sound, which I did with Dr. Anthony Bohorquez in collaboration with the NOAA Milford Lab. And we published in Environmental Science and Technology. That has included with Ellen's lab, a review of ecological characteristics of NPAs in China. We published in Science Advances. Also making I worked in fisheries conservation actually for a year and a half after my postdoc with the Pew Charitable Trust and the Ocean Foundation, working hands-on with some of the regional fishery management organizations for tuna and tuna-like species. That includes publication on making a science-based case for managing some small tropical tuna stocks as forage fish more than as large predators. And over the years, it's included other opportunities, including regular field work and data analysis for Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program. Most recently, this has included work on international coral reef management. So if anyone's familiar with Dr. Corinne Kleinhaus, she won an NSF grant to study coral reef resilience in the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea, which has showed incredible resilience. For anyone who's familiar with these types of metrics, during the global mass bleaching event in 2023 and 2024, they were exposed to 30-degree heating weeks. It's basically a measure of exposure to heat over time. Most reefs around the world, 8-degree heating weeks would be enough to have almost full bleaching and mass mortalities. Here, less than 10% of one species you experience any bleaching, and they have since experienced a full recovery. So the idea is to say that there are resilient reefs out there, but you have those other threats against them. And a lot of these threats are transboundary threats or international threats or regional threats, right? Let's take, for example, another location, such as the Mesoamerican Reef in the Caribbean. We have to consider the fact that conservation begins at the local level, but this is an example of a reef that transcends international borders, depends on genetic exchange with reefs elsewhere in the Caribbean, such as Cuba, and we haven't thought yet about the watershed and resulting land-based pollution and sedimentation that spans these 4 countries, basically, that covers the Mesoamerican Reef: Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. So countries need to work together for coral reef conservation. And there are challenges to that. So what we did is I joined Corinne Kleinhaus and McElroy on this grant, and I was tasked with developing a workshop to bring coral reef conservation and scientific experts from around the world, with a particular focus on Red Sea countries in East Africa, as well as the Caribbean, and those from with global expertise as well. Ellen and her graduate student Natalia joined us for this. So we held this workshop on campus about in June of last year. And the result is basically a series of kind of case studies where we brought these experts together and had them map out through what we call social ecological systems mapping to understand what the primary threats were to coral resilience in these places. And then kind of what the indirect threats were, and map what are the key pressure points for actually supporting resilience and conservation in each region. And then at the global level, we then reconvened everyone to compare results and to see where there are commonalities and differences across the 2 regions, the Red Sea and the Caribbean, and how that can interconnect with policy and action at the global level. And this is kind of a simplistic view of how it was brought together, but it kind of identifies where the key pressure points are globally for supporting coral reef resilience, both through direct interventions, such as area-based management and ecosystem restoration. This is where communities need to really work as a region primarily, but with support from global policy, capacity strengthening, community engagement, thinking globally about global financial resources and global knowledge management, and then understanding how regional political coordination sits at the crux of this, of kind of instilling and organizing global resources to result in regional level action. And again, there's a lot of intricacies in each specific region, a lot of context specific matters. Such as the fact that in talk about regional political coordination, they are both barriers in the Caribbean and the Red Sea, but how they are barriers are much different. The Red Sea, we're dealing with a lot more armed conflicts and direct conflict. The Caribbean is more of an area that is decentralized and needs to come together for further collaboration. So this work, we have a paper in review that's had a minor revisions request, so we're hoping to see that published soon. But we've also wanted to maximize the audience who can see this, particularly at the international policy level. So we also published a white paper, co-published with the New York Climate Exchange. And we had dedicated side events at the UN Ocean Conference, co-sponsored by the New York Climate Exchange, as well as General Organization for the Conservation of Corals and Sea Turtles of the Red Sea, a Saudi Arabia-based organization that sponsored the entire Coral Pavilion at the UN Oceans Conference alongside Bloomberg, support of the International Coral Reef Initiative. So we've seen a lot of really good, exciting coverage on this, and we're hoping to see the peer review publication now soon. But that's kind of shows an example of when I mean other fields that are maybe a little bit outside of my expertise, that I'm always keen to engage with. That's kind of the most recent example. And I'm keen to find more. And that's where organizations like SoMAS are really important for me in helping make sure I stay close to the science and broaden my perspectives. So thinking next, what are some potential opportunities for collaborations in my field in conservation, finance, and oceanography? So again, I thrive in scientific institutions, access to diverse and versatile colleagues. And I think it's, this area also of my area of expertise also brings value to it by helping to kind of contextualize a lot of the research being done here in socioeconomic terms. SoMAS is a really important institution for Long Island and the broader New York metropolitan area. So opportunities for community engagement, and ultimately, the most innovative ideas for ocean finance come from being close to the science to facilitate exploring connections between nature and society where none may have been seen before. So that could include what are some options for potential hypothetical ideas here. This could be the potential to bring in a lot of the expertise or ideas that I've worked on globally and seeing how can we bring them here locally. That could include finance facilities or platforms that can provide financial support for fishing industry or other coastal stakeholders who need to adapt their practices or adapt their equipment to accommodate a changing environment. Technical assistance facilities to help facilitate innovative business concepts or ideas like alternative forms of aquaculture, including for macroalgae. And perhaps similar to some of the global funds I work with for coral reefs or for the ocean economy at large, a dedicated Long Island Sound or New York Bight finance hub or fund or facility. Thinking more locally, even specific financial mechanisms that I have seen apply elsewhere around the world, parametric insurance to support nature-based solutions for coastal protection, like what we've seen with coral reefs, could potentially be applied for sand dunes or coastal marshes. Nitrogen crediting for coastal wetland restoration, other forms of payment for ecosystem services, or taking some of the methodologies here that could be integrated into finance systems such as biodiversity credits, which could be based on a metric and methodology such as eDNA. And a lot of this work of kind of cross-pollination across disciplines and across levels from global to local is very much at the center of the mission of the New York Climate Exchange. So it's been great to collaborate with them on the coral reef work that they're doing. And then I have another concept I've been working on in the early stages on the idea of facilitating partnerships between scientific organizations and the financial community, understanding that those partnerships are key to identifying the problems that financial mechanisms are meant to solve, helping raise the funds, including by partnering with scientific organizations to help us understand better about ocean environmental and economic systems, how those funds should be allocated, and how we can monitor the environmental impact of that funding over time. So as ocean finance becomes more mainstream, we have to make sure that it's done right. And these types of science and finance partnerships are key to that. And I think long term, could also be an important source of funding for the scientific community through greater engagement with those types of financial institutions, particularly when a number of sources of funding for science are more limited now. So with that, again, thank you to so much for the invitation, and thank you to the various organizations that have funded this work over the years, and of course, Alan and others at Stony Brook. You've been great support.
All right, as always, we have two students asking questions first, Michael and John. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Before entering the program here, I worked at an environmental nonprofit, and I guess my question is like, what do you do when you're running into other parties, probably private interests that are not just maybe apathetic or lack information, or actively have a vested interest against what you're trying to do, or like if you're trying to prohibit a certain activity and they have a vested interest in maintaining that, like what is your approach?
Yeah, I think it depends on the industry you're engaging with. Some are more receptible than others, and we've seen that in a number of organizations we've been scoping as potential willing partners for various types of initiatives. And you kind of have to do a little bit of digging beforehand and understand what their motivations might be. But I think the general word of advice I would have is you have to go into those conversations in listening mode first, even if you know what the answers might be. And understand that those types of discussions can take a lot of time. Be prepared to answer. Yeah, I think certainly always focus on the positives. Again, not being too combative. Focusing on positives of what they can do, because no one wants to feel like they're the enemy.
Thank you.
And is Jung here? Okay, thank you.
I have one question related to the financial assessment model. And in the step 3, when analyzing how do we quantify and hedge the practical and the ecological risks of the new or expanding funding sources to ensure their long-term viability.
So I understand that part of the long-term sustainability of those, but what do you mean about the ecological risks?
Yeah, the long-term reliability of the expanding.
Yeah, the best thing to do is ideally a marine protected area, if it is well managed, would also have clear, historic, transparent accounting. So you could see over time what have the risks been for this area. Granted, doesn't mean that there aren't risks that are very real that just haven't been seen yet. With the available data for most MPAs, it's not really that financial history isn't as ideal as we would like it to be, oftentimes because of limited capacity for things like accounting and financial management. So it's hard to be able to develop that in some sort of like risk-based algorithm. But you have to understand in kind of qualitative terms, if you see what are the types of events that could lead to a major cutoff in this, be it anything from a global pandemic that shuts down travel to bleaching or sea level rise or hurricanes that might destroy the tourism infrastructure to accommodate, say, for example, that income source. So it's very case by case in that respect, and it's because we're dealing a lot of the time with low data scenarios or just big differences in the data available. So there's no standard risk evaluation approach yet for marine protected areas broadly, case by case.
Hi, that was a good talk. My question is kind of related in a sense. So your project in the Red Sea, I was just kind of wondering if first you like the resilience strategies that you were talking about, is there an idea of what those would be? And if that goes into the realm of like developing new in there, how exactly, is that project going to combat issues of enforcement transcendent between those countries? especially in an area like that where, transportation routes and things like that are major, source of income, source of pollution for the reefs there, so. Kind of two-part question.
Yeah, I mean, you think the pressure is there. There's been a lot of coastal development. There's been a lot of coastal development, overfishing, so there's land-based pollution. And yeah, there's the entire, there's for whatever percent of the world's oil supply is also being transited through the Suez Canal and right next to those reefs, and that has been a problem at times in the past. So then the second part of your question was what's the related to the MPAs?
Yeah, kind of are there any resilient strategy ideas that are like already being developed when
Yeah.
this gets funded, and how will enforcement take place to transcend over both countries?
So the challenge historically in the Red Sea is that you have generally a lack of set initiatives historically. And you also have a number of countries with very, very limited capacity, right? You have Red Sea countries, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Yemen, Eritrea, Sudan. Of those, there's a lot of the funding and institutional capacity is kind of limited to Saudi Arabia and Israel. Saudi Arabia has been stepping up lately into more of a leadership role, including through what they call SHAMS, which is the Saudi Arabian organization for world conservation for the Red Sea. They are starting to be more outreaching, which is good to see. Partnering with a lot of organizations, and they are trying to bring some degree of international coordination in the region, but obviously with political dynamics there, it's still a challenge.
Sorry if I missed this, but how close is your team to blue carbon finance? So when I was working at NGO, it seemed to be what's all like everybody was talking about, but it seems like what you've developed is way more integrative.
Yeah.
But everybody's talking. When I was at the NGO, it's all anybody was mentioning. So the blue carbon component rather than anything else.
Yeah, I think some of the issues around blue carbon, there have been times when it's been talked about as like a silver bullet. It's not. It's one of the many options out there. So when I do an evaluation, for example, of a marine protected area, it's within the portfolio of potential scenarios. The challenge barriers for blue carbon in particular are that terrestrial carbon offsets are still limited, but much more common. One of the reasons is that they are much easier to actually do the carbon accounting, right? And when we look at blue carbon, let's start looking at blue carbon ecosystems, so mostly coastal wetlands, mangroves, marshes, seagrass beds. The science around carbon sequestration there is much more complex. Like we understand that they have the potential to sequester carbon in much higher concentrations for much longer periods than terrestrial forests. But when you're dealing with the fact that most of the carbon isn't because of the trees growing there, but it's through horizontal transport and capturing, plus the fact that you're logistically trying to do that in an aquatic environment, it becomes really expensive and very logistically challenging and complex to do the carbon accounting properly for a blue carbon ecosystem. So hopefully there's still a lot of interest in doing that and pioneering those approaches. So we can potentially scale that to a point where the cost barrier is a lot less, because the cost of doing it requires a price point in the carbon market that's above what's available right now. Beyond those blue carbon ecosystems, there's been talk about could we do a carbon sequestration related to whale falls or related to bottom trawling, serving the sediment, but the science, the jury is still out in the science on that, and also how would you even go about measuring that to demonstrate a degree of sequestration and enough certainty to actually register a credit around it.
Okay, just that's one follow-up.
Okay.
Are there any countries that have actually developed and have got to the point where they're illustrating a sustainable blue carbon model? Because the group I work with was sort of focused in the Bahamas. It seemed like everything moved really quickly, and then it sort of didn't.
Yeah,
And that was focused predominantly on seagrass, but there were issues with raising the initial capital to even begin sort of doing the surveys so that you do the carbon accreditation process.
there is no carbon like country. It's mostly been very local and tapping into voluntary credits. So the blue carbon projects that have been piloted to this point haven't actually really been regulated under any sort of publicly mandated program, like let's say European carbon credit trade. So it's been kind of opportunistic and engaging the public sector, whether it's the private sector, whether it's doing something locally in Kenya and maybe partnering with airlines to help provide the funding. The other part too with it is that most of the credits so far have been related to restoration. I want to say most, it's turning, but the thing is that restoration is expensive and difficult to scale. The real, where the money really is and where the potential for scale really is on avoided destruction. But then proving that avoided destruction is basically what's the added value of that funding to support something that would have been destroyed otherwise. It's a challenge.
All right, last question.
Excellent talk. One reason why I think US forests are not completely denuded because logging leases require reforestation, right? And that was established in the 70s. So my question is adjacent to carbon, I guess, but how do we, as a part of this, asking or telling looters and fishers, oil companies, for example, that part of the cost of doing business is conservation and restoration of actual habitat, rather than this sort of blue carbon, fish and actual credits and how those things get allocated is. Just curious what part of the portfolio is that?
Is sorry, related to the cost of doing business, showing how.
Exactly, like asking polluters and fishers or telling them, regulating them, say, if you're going to release this much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you're required to actively be engaged in the conservation of a certain example characters.
Yeah, there is kind of a mechanism for that called biodiversity offsets, which is meant to be kind of analogous to a carbon offset, but for biodiversity. If you destroy a wetland and build a factory, you have to restore a wetland somewhere else. The problem is that, and though there are laws for that, and there are laws for marine ones, the ocean-related ones are only really integrating the policy in 6 countries, about maybe 7. Problem is that there's still that moral issue of like being okay to pollute if you can pay for it, but there's also the fact that logistically most of them aren't enforced. So there's a permit to say, well, you can destroy this wetland as long as you restore one somewhere else, but that restoration is never actually done. So there's another kind of mechanism now that's being similar to that, but it's called biodiversity credits. That's supposed to be additive, and that any company can purchase or any individual can purchase, even if they're not actively destroying the environment, but to support biodiversity conservation elsewhere. I'm not sure that answers your question on like how do you tell them that, but yeah,
I think it could.
I think it again the strategy depends on some of them. It's very clear practical economic interests, right? Like nature-based solutions for coastal protection for ports and coastal developments. In other cases, it's entirely PR related. So it's
All right, let's move this conversation to lunch, and thank you so much.